So I'd just like to start by first acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we are on today. We're from all over the place. So feel free to put the lands that, or the country that you are joining from in the chat. I'm joining you today from Yagara and Turrbal country. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that might be joining us today. Would anybody, if there is anybody who does identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander who would like to do an introduction to country, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll just acknowledge the different countries that we come from. So some quick housekeeping. Thank you so much for joining us today for this TASA Thursday. It's a special postgraduate and ECR session. So that's where it's targeted at, but of course it's open and welcome to anyone that wants to join. I'm Laura Simpson Reeves. I'm a member of the TASA Postgraduate Portfolio Subcommittee and I'm your host for today. I'd also like to acknowledge our portfolio leader, Anthony KJ Smith, and our executive officer, Sally, who provided a lot of assistance in the lead up to this event and would not be possible without them. So thank you. Another quick note that today's session will be recorded and then the recording will be placed up on YouTube. So if that is something that you are concerned about or mindful of, please feel free to turn your cameras off so that your image won't show up, or you can change your name on Zoom. We also ask that if you can please keep your microphones muted during the session unless you're asking a question, which can help avoid any unwanted background noise. So today's session is called How to Publish, a behind the scenes look at the journal publishing process. So publishing in high quality peer reviewed journals is a necessary part of being a scholar, but can be incredibly daunting for PhD students, ECRs, possibly even academics who are more advanced in their careers. It's something that we all need to do, but we don't really know how or why it works. So this session is designed to help provide some insider info on the publishing process and behind the scenes look. And we are fortunate enough to have two wonderful panelists here today who will help us to understand that. So we will have a series of questions and a conversation with the panelists, and then there'll be some time at the end for any Q&A that you would like to ask. So you can always pop questions in the chat as we go, and we can address them either as we're going or at the end, or you can ask the question online towards the end of the session. So to get started, I'll introduce our two panelists. So our first panelist is Associate Professor Sarah MacLean, and she's the Joint Editor-in-Chief of Health Sociology Review. Through her research, Sarah seeks to understand people's perspectives on alcohol, other drug use and gambling, and to support the development of policy and interventions. She focuses on how marginality, for example, indigeneity, poverty, gender and sexuality, impact on and is in turn produced by these social practices. Her PhD explored the capacity of inhalant, volatile substance use, to offer socially excluded young people opportunities to enact desired selfhoods. She completed postdoctoral research investigating place-based differences in experiences of alcohol consumption, funded by an ARC postdoctoral fellowship. She then took up a senior research fellowship at the, and I apologise in advance if I pronounce this incorrectly, the ONEMDA. Sorry?
I think it's
ONEMDA Koori Health Unit at the University of Melbourne. She's currently employed as an associate professor in the discipline of social work and social policy at La Trobe University in Melbourne, which, as I'm sure many of us are aware, are currently in lockdown at the moment. And she's been appointed the Joint Editor-in-Chief of Health Sociology Review for the period of 2019 to 2022. So she's a little over halfway through that. We also have Dr Allegra Schermuly here. And again, I apologise if I pronounced your surname incorrectly.
Right.
I was practicing, but I'm not the best at pronunciation. Probably shouldn't be presenting here. So to introduce Allegra. So Dr. Allegra is an ARC Research Fellow in Sociology at Monash University, also in Melbourne, working on projects related to antimicrobial futures and societies and evidence for AMR communication and education. And this is in conjunction with the Centre to Impact AMR, which is the Antimicrobial Futures at Monash. She has an interdisciplinary background with a PhD in sociology and a career as a registered nurse in the UK and Australia. She's currently part of the COVID-19 vaccination workforce and undertaking a postgraduate certificate at La Trobe University to certify as a nurse immuniser. Allegra has published her work in international journals, including Critical Public Health, Sociology of Health and Illness, and Critical Sociology. She's also the current managing editor of the Journal of Sociology. So thank you both for joining us. We might start with Sarah, if you can give a bit of a quick background on what your role as an editor looks like on a daily basis.
Okay, better start by unmuting. So I work with Professor Karen Willis, also at La Trobe, and we are the joint editors-in-chief of Health Sociology Review. And we do, I wanted to acknowledge Karen because we really do just about everything in consultation with each other, and we're constantly asking each other to check decisions because it's really difficult to read papers and decide whether or not they should go to review. I find that really, really hard to make the call sometimes. So it's really great that I've got Karen that I can get a second opinion from. So we've been, we applied to be editors-in-chief of the journal in 2018 and we were successful. We ran with a team of associate editors and I won't run through them, but we've also added people to that list and it's just been really fantastic to have them too because a lot of the actual work of managing papers is done by the associate editors. We also have the wonderful Sally Daly, who's our managing editor, and she does a lot of work in making sure that the papers that we receive meet the guidelines before she sends them to us to have a look at. So on a day-to-day level, a lot of what we do is really having a first look at papers. Sally will send us papers, and I'll talk a bit more about this when we get to the just reject and we'll read them. And then we often assign an associate editor to manage that paper through the review process. And that means that person, sometimes with advice from me and or Karen, will look for reviewers and use the online system to send it out to review, read the reviews. And then when it comes back from review, we will look at it again and just check over what the associate editor said about how that paper should proceed. So there's some other more strategic jobs that we have that are also, you know, a really interesting part of being an editor-in-chief. And the one that I like a lot is deciding on and commissioning the special issues. And we publish 3 issues per year at Health Sociology Review. And one of those is usually a special issue, sometimes 2, but sometimes none. That's a really interesting opportunity for us to focus in depth on a particular kind of emerging issue in health sociology. So I suppose what we really do is hopefully set some kind of strategic direction for the journal. We clarify what kinds of things the journal publishes, and we're really clear on our website about the things that we're interested in and the things that we're not interested in publishing. And we manage the day-to-day papers, and we also keep in touch with the editorial team and run meetings with them. Do other jobs too, like assessing the best paper award as well. We're currently doing that too. So there's a lot of work associated with being an associate editor. It's a really interesting way of getting your head around sociology fairly broadly in a way that I probably wouldn't if I wasn't doing this, and forcing me to read things outside my specific area of interest. That might be enough for now though.
Great, thanks Sarah. And is a co-editorship model quite common?
Yeah, it is. Before us, it was Joanne Bright and Christy Newman. They co-edited the journal. So I think it's a really good way to do it. I mean, it's a lot of work, and I wouldn't want to do it on my own, and I wouldn't want to be responsible for all the decisions that we have to make on my own. It's great to have 2 people do it. 3 would even work.
Great, thank you so much. It does definitely sounds like a lot of work. There's a lot of things in there that I wasn't aware of that would fall under the editor sort of bannership.
It's a lot of meetings. We also have to report to TASA quite a few times a year.
There's a lot of work in that.
Mm.
Great, thank you. And how about you, Allegra? What do you do
Yeah,
in your role as managing editor?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for making the effort to join us today. So Sarah's spelled it out really clearly, but so my role with Journal of Sociology is I'm the managing editor, and so that's the equivalent role to Sally's role at Health Sociology Review. And I work in conjunction. We just have one editor-in-chief at JOS, and that's Helen Forbes-Mewett at Monash. So we work closely together to, I guess, decide which papers are going to come into the journal, or at least be given the opportunity to be reviewed. My main role is quite administrative. So all the papers, when they're first submitted, come to me first. So I'm the one that checks it to see whether it's the right length, for example, and whether it seems from a first read appropriate for JOS. We're a fairly general sociology journal, as you probably all know, but occasionally we do get things that we think might be better suited to a more specialized journal. For example, sometimes we get things that we might recommend to the author that they submit to Health Sociology Review, for example. And that's not to say that we don't have health related papers in JOS, but just occasionally things are very, very niche, and we might suggest another journal for them, particularly another one of Sage's journals. We're encouraged to suggest, but if we know another avenue that might be a bit better, we might recommend that. And probably all the other things to do with my role will come out when we answer the other questions for you, I think.
Great, thank you. And just to clarify, that was you would possibly recommend other journals before you sent it out to peer review. So this is right at the initial.
It's right at the beginning. So things come to me. This is before it's gone to an editor or anything. So we get a lot of papers that are completely inappropriate. But obviously we get papers that are clearly appropriate and clearly are going to end up in the journal. But there's an awful lot of papers in between, which are a bit more tricky to make a decision about, and I'm sure Sarah would relate to this. And with those papers, we have a think about whether we think sending it out to review with JOS is appropriate, or whether perhaps before it would be better that they send it to another journal altogether. So yeah.
Can I just jump in there and add something from Health Sociology Review? We would never suggest people, unless we would only suggest another journal as part of desk rejecting it.
Okay.
So that's what I'm talking about. I mean, it's I guess it's a way to soften the reject decision in a way.
Yeah.
So I guess that's maybe a good time to jump then to our first question, which is about how to avoid a desk rejection. And we've already talked a little bit about this, but for those that maybe aren't familiar with the term, Sarah, could you maybe just explain quickly what a desk reject is? And then we've already talked a little bit about the process at JOS and maybe what you do at Health Sociology Review.
Sure. So a desk reject is when it doesn't go out to review, but it's rejected on the first by the editors. And the context for that is that we get a lot of papers that are submitted to the journal. Sally just emailed me, I think it was 355 or something like that. Sally, are you there? Can you correct me? But and of those, we actually desk reject 77%. So that's a really, really high proportion of the papers. So if you get a desk reject, never feel like that's a terrible thing. It's actually, nearly 80% of the papers for our journal. I'm sure other journals are really similar. And it is heartbreaking. It's the part of the role that I really hate. I find it really distressing. People have put a lot of work in, they formatted it for our journal, and so many of the papers get desk rejected. So there's two reasons for that. One is that we only publish 3 issues a year. That's part of our contract with Taylor and Francis. That's what we've got. Each of those has got 7. We can put about 7 articles into each of the editions. One is usually devoted to to being special issues. So we fill that up with articles that are on a particular topic, which really gives us 14 papers per year. So we have to be very, very selective. Another reason is that it's actually very hard to find reviewers, and we've sent papers out that we've been a bit unsure about. Sometimes I think, oh, I think this one could probably improve through the review process. And then we get blasted by reviewers just saying, why did you send this to me? It's terrible. You've wasted my time. So we have a lot of people who decline to review, and we spend a lot of time looking for people and begging people to review papers. So we can't send every paper out, although we'd really like to, because we just simply cannot get reviewers to do that. So most of the papers that we do desk reject, the reason is because they just aren't suitable to the aims and scope of our journal. Can I just quickly screen share? Is that all right, Laura? Just to show you the page where all that information is available.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll see whether I can
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say I'll make a co-host.
Oh, okay. Oh, looks like I can screen share. Oh, you've disabled screen share. It says host has disabled participant screen sharing.
I'll just make you co-host. There you go.
I'll just pop it into the chat and everyone can look at it.
You can screen share now.
I've just popped it into the chat, but here we go. So what's really, can you see the aims and scopes of health sociology review now?
Yeah.
So what the main reason that people get desk rejected is because they haven't looked at what our journal does. And what we say here, it's buried somewhere in here. Submissions must make a clear contribution to sociological inquiry relevant to health. So we get a lot of papers that we actually suggest should go to public health journals or to qualitative health journals, because they're just not engaging with sociological theory. And that's the decision that our team has made, and that is the journal's rationale for existing. So we can't publish everything that we want to. So most of the papers get desk rejected because they don't fit the aims and scope of our I'm going to stop share now of the journal. But quite often also the process is that Sally, who's our managing editor for Health Sociology Review, will look at them, and she reviews them to check that they're anonymised appropriately, so that we can send them out to blind review, that they're not over the word length, that they don't have too many tables and figures that are going to blow out the journal. And it's not because we're mean and we want to, reduce the space that people are allowed to write in, but as if we get one paper with a lot of tables and figures, we have to drop another paper because we simply only allowed so many pages in each edition of the journal. Sally does all that. And quite often, if she thinks that it might be a desk reject, if she thinks it's not going to fit those criteria that are in the aims and scope, she'll send it to me and Karen, and we'll desk reject it at that point, so that the authors don't have to spend a lot of time reformatting it or blinding it or doing whatever it is that we require, and then get a reject after that. So we do often try to put in some kind of note. We suggest you send it to a public health journal, or we suggest you send it to a political science journal, to soften that. And also because we want them to understand that it could be a really great paper, it could be a fantastic paper, it's just not what we publish. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that nearly 80% of desk rejects, if I know when I send something out and it doesn't get a desk reject, I take that as a huge win. And I also take major revisions as a huge win, because that's almost always what gets allocated. It's quite rare to get a paper back from review and only want minor revisions. So it's important to keep all that in mind, because it's pretty hard work dealing with rejections and expectations of major revision on your kind of beautiful work that you've spent so long on. I think that might be enough for me at that point.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe you'd like me to explain why we desk reject things from JOS. So really key things, and everybody write these down, because these are just obvious things that your paper will get desk rejected. So the number one reason why I desk reject things is because people don't follow the guidelines, but the main thing is that people don't follow the word limit guidelines. That's the number one thing. So guys, get the word limit. Within the word limit for JOS, it's 6,000 to 8,000 words, okay? If your paper's, obviously if it's a couple of words off, but essentially if your paper is way off that, I'm not even going to read it, guys, all right? I know it sounds harsh, but as Sarah said, there's a lot of papers. So if you don't bother following the guidelines, we're not going to read it, I'm afraid. So that's the number one thing that you can get right. Have it the right number of words, and things like properly anonymized. I always check papers. Papers always slip through. Every single month, papers slip through that I've not properly, I have missed, that they haven't been properly anonymized or something. This actually loses us reviewers, because what happens is then the editor sends it out for review, and the person that's agreed to review it comes back and says, I actually know this person, I can't review this paper. And then not only have we wasted time, I look like an idiot, and we've lost a reviewer, which is a big deal because reviews are really hard to get. I do try and read and check the anonymity of all papers, but as I say, things do creep in. And so please, guys, all papers need to be anonymized.
What's the best way to do that, Allegra? What's the best way to make sure our papers?
Best way to do it is go into the search function on your Word, on your Microsoft Word, and put your name in. That's how I do it. And check through, make sure you haven't used your own name at all. Also, make sure you haven't done things like said, I collected this data and then made it obvious what department or something that you're from. But the way that I do it is I run all the papers through the just the search function on Microsoft Word, and just search for your own name. Make sure nothing slipped through. That's what I do with my own work, and that's what I do with everybody's paper that comes through, assuming it's the right word limit, of course. Other things that you can get right: spell the title correctly. I'm not saying that I would reject something on the basis of the title being spelled incorrectly, but it does not start things off well if you spelled something wrong in the title, and you'd be amazed how many people do. It's just, what you have to remember is, as Sarah said, your paper is competing with an awful lot of other papers. So really, unless it needs to be right up there. It needs to be right. And these are little things that everybody can get right. These are the small things that you can do to put yourself in the frame. And one more thing, and then I won't go on about it any longer, and we're going to talk about cover letters in a minute. Actually, I'm not going to talk about them, but I'm going to make a point about them. But what people sometimes do is, after they've obviously submitted their paper to another journal, been rejected by another journal, they then send it to us. They send us a cover letter with the other journal's name in it, because they haven't properly changed everything over. You'll be amazed how often that happens, and I'm sorry, but that's a straight reject, because if you can't be bothered changing that, you've obviously, for a start, it kind of makes you feel second best at JOS. We're like, oh, so we're obviously not your first choice of journal. But also, if you can't be bothered with that, then we can't be bothered reading your paper, to be quite honest. So that's all I'm going to say about desk rejection. But basically, follow the guidelines and get the basics right, and you have a much better chance of your paper, as Sarah said, getting to the next stage. And if your paper gets to the next stage, it's right in the race then. Hope all that makes sense and it doesn't come across too harsh, but those are things that we can all do. It doesn't matter how senior or junior a scholar you are, everybody can do those things.
And there's such simple things that we can do to just get over that first hurdle.
And it's amazing how many people don't do those things. That's what has stunned me in doing this role.
Do you often get cover letters, Sarah, with the wrong journal?
Yes, we do. That's hilarious. But it's it doesn't make us feel loved.
No, it makes you feel very second-rate journal.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know that I can be bothered with this paper. And like I say, it's such an easy thing to get right. But maybe, Laura, maybe you want us to talk about cover letters next anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue into, should we send a cover letter? If we do, what should we put in it? I mean, obviously the right journal name is a good start.
That's a good start.
That's certainly a good start.
Do you want to go first on this one, Allegra?
Yeah, because I've got one thing to say, and that is do not waste your time, guys. Do not waste your time. Put all your energy into your paper. If your paper is right, your paper will get over the line. Cover letter, I would say don't even bother. But anyway, but Sarah might have something different to say.
No, look, when I saw this, I was just embarrassed because I thought, I'm not even sure that we look at the cover letters.
I don't look at them, and
I think they're required. I think people have to put one in which case they should just say, "Dear X, here is my paper, thank you," or something like that. Because if like, there's absolutely no point in putting the purpose of the point of your paper in, because that should be apparent in the abstract. And I think one of the things that I should have said before about how to report a gesture reject, another really important thing is the abstract explains why this is a useful contribution to the literature. Because we've got so few spots to put papers in, we want to know that what we publish is going to add something. And this is dreadful, but we also want to hope that it's going to be citable, because that determines our metrics and impact factor and all those kinds of things. So as soon as we're looking at papers, we're thinking, does this add something that makes it worthwhile publishing, and will someone cite it? And so you need to make that really, really clear in the abstract. And we will definitely look at the abstract. We may look at the letter. When Sally sends us the papers, she doesn't send us the cover letter, she just sends us the papers. If they get through to review, we might look at the cover letter then, but it's not important in our decision making. I think perhaps no one should have them. It's just a waste of time.
It's a waste of everybody's time. Don't even bother.
I think, sorry, it's just Sally here. I think it might be part of the process though. Like it's a box that you have to tick. So when you're submitting, so that, as they're saying, just keep them short.
But we could, Sally, we could ask Scholar One why we have to have that process.
They could probably take it off for you. We don't have it at JOS.
Oh, really? Well, let's think about doing that, Sally, because I don't think we ever use them. Do you?
Yeah. I used to in the beginning when I took over the role.
Did you?
I would look at them.
Yeah.
But it has no impact on whether a paper goes out for review or not. So.
No, it really shouldn't, because the paper has to stand or fall on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's good to know that even though it's still feels compulsory, because as you're submitting through the online process, most journals have now, lots of journals use Scholar One or Manuscript Central to submit those, asks you for a cover letter. So it's good to know that's not where we should be spending our energy.
No.
Yeah, don't spend your energy on it. Spend your energy on getting all those other things spot on, and also obviously on your paper and on a brilliant abstract. Like Sarah brought up something really good point, the best abstract that you can possibly write that tells us why we should go on further in the process with your paper,
and submit it to a journal that actually is interested in what you're writing about.
So is that one way that we can help convince you that it's the right fit for the journal, is
through the abstract?
The way we write the abstract?
I think, look, when I just reject papers, I'm looking at them with the aims and scope of our journal in mind, and also I'm reading it for quality. Do I think it's a good paper, or is it at a point where it's ready to go out to review? So yes, definitely. But I want to know that it adds something useful.
So so looking at that aims and scope, like we talked about in terms of reject, is one of the best ways we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also not being, if you get a desk reject, it may well be that you chose the wrong journal. It may be no comment whatsoever on the quality of your paper. And you often don't know that. And we run out of time. We don't have a lot of time to give feedback. And another thing that I find really difficult is that sometimes I've provided feedback to authors about why we've just rejected it. And then the next day I wake up and there's an email in my inbox saying, okay, if I fix that up again, can I put it back in? And that is often really difficult, because then we get the paper and it's still not satisfactory, and they've asked us again, and that we feel kind of like that point, like we should send it out to review. So I've sort of stopped giving a lot of feedback on desk rejects, because it starts up this process that often just wastes more time for the authors.
That's good to know. So kind of think of a desk reject as possibly more of a fit with journal rather than commentary on the.
I mean, sometimes it is that the quality is you know, we get a 3,000 word article and our journal takes 7,500 word articles that are very thoughtful and well referenced, and so the paper's not suitable for that reason.
The other thing to mention as well, Laura, is that sometimes we just, for example, we might have received a very, not a similar article, but an article on the same topic the previous day. So sometimes you might just get rejected because we've just had lots of articles on that topic, or just accepted a very similar article recently. So that's just pure bad luck. And to be quite honest, there's not a lot you can do about that except dust yourself off and try another journal. And as far as the thing with engaging with responses when we just reject your paper, I don't know how it is at HSR, but I get a lot of very upset, rude emails from people, to the point of it being, you know, quite abusive at times when we just reject things.
Yeah.
And as I think Sarah's already explained, it's a very thoughtful process from our end, quite an agonizing process, because we're scholars ourselves, and I'm a junior scholar. I haven't published a massive amount. I know what it's like getting rejected as much as the next person does, and I would never inflict that on a colleague just willy-nilly, you know, without thinking it through. But we very often do get abusive. I would say I get at least one abusive email a week from authors that we've rejected their papers, and it's obvious that the email's been sent in anger. So our policy, should I say, at JOS is not to engage. I just delete the email. But, you know, it does kind of chip away at your enthusiasm for doing the role. So I would say, don't bother sending an angry email after we just reject your paper, because it won't do anything for your chances next time. And like I say, all the decisions are thought through, and they're based on an awful lot of different factors. Including just the fact that we may have already published, like, for example, we have published a lot of articles on COVID-19 already, including having a special issue last year. So we do, I'm not saying we don't accept, that wouldn't be correct to say that, but we're very discerning which COVID-19 related articles we accept, because otherwise we could just have COVID-19 related JOS forever.
Yeah, absolutely. So could we. We could have 1,000 papers that just said, oh, look, exactly the same thing happened in X country, Y country, Z country, and we can't publish all of those.
Yeah. So anyway,
in terms of trying to find the right journal, and I mean, I guess this probably sounds quite obvious, but like, would you recommend going through recent issues and seeing what's been published and if anything's too similar? I mean, obviously that doesn't help.
Yeah.
Maybe already out for review, but get a bit of an idea.
Yeah, I think that's worthwhile.
Yeah, it's always a good idea to look at journals that you're thinking of publishing in and what they've published recently. Personally, speaking as an author, not as an editor, I would say I actually try and include an article, at least one article from that journal in my reference list, just to show that you're a bit engaged with it. I mean, not always, but I have done that on occasion and it's been successful.
I do that too.
Yeah. As a junior scholar, that was one of the first pieces of advice that I got, was what journal you want to target and then what articles from there might be relevant.
Yeah, yeah.
But really what you need to do is look at the aims and objectives that are on the internet.
Yeah. So looking for the aims and scope.
Yeah.
There's a question about if you do get a rejection sort of prior to it going out for review, is it appropriate to ask for more feedback, or is it because you've got so many papers that you're going through, it's not really worth asking for why? Like, would you necessarily tell people that it's because you've just recently accepted a paper that was on a similar topic?
To be quite honest, I wouldn't respond, because it's just too many emails and it just gets into that, then I'm justifying the decision, you know, that kind of thing. So to be quite honest, I wouldn't waste your time. I would just I would just send it to another journal, because it's not going to make any difference to the decision in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And especially, I guess, if you're desk rejecting, you know, approximately 80%, like that's quite a lot of people contacting you.
It is, yeah. That said, we also occasionally, and this is not about desk rejects, but say if a paper's gone to review and then we ask them to do something and then we ask them to do something more to it, we sometimes get emails back from authors saying, I really don't think that's appropriate, blah, 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 with a good reason. And sometimes we'll just say, okay, I think you're right. So you can engage with the authors. But I guess at the point of desk reject, less so because the decision's already been made to reject it.
Yeah. So at that initial stage, there's no point kind of coming back to you or arguing the point.
And please don't think anyone enjoys desk rejecting.
No.
It's awful.
We'd much rather receive a paper that we send on. It's much more, makes the role much more worthwhile. So that's why it's good for people to avoid the silly reasons for being desk rejected, because, you know.
Yeah. Making sure it's the right fit, meeting all the guidelines.
Yeah. I mean, the right fit thing is not that, I agree, it's not always easy, but the things like the word limit and the real basics.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit already about what happens once we submit the paper, and it goes through usually to the managing editor for review, and then they'll recommend up to the editor. What happens after that?
So shall I go first this time, Allegra?
Go for it.
So once Sally will send a paper through, Sally reads them all and checks off that they're compliant with our formatting and word length and other requirements. If she thinks there's an obvious desk reject, we'll do it at that point. But if not, she'll send it through to either me or Karen. At that point, we read it really carefully, and we may at that point decide that it's a desk reject because Sally hasn't sent it to us earlier by email, but at that point we think that it's not worth, that it's not strong enough to go out to review. Quite often we'll email it around to each other and say, what do you think about this one? Or I don't, I'm not across all of sociology, so I'll ask one of the associate editors, is this one, what do you think about this one? About Bourdieu? I don't know anything about, I don't know heaps about Bourdieu. Shouldn't really say I don't know anything about Bourdieu.
You get loads of articles about Bourdieu.
Oh, so many.
All the time.
Yeah, I should know a lot about Bourdieu now after reading all these articles.
Yeah. Not just Foucault?
No, it's Bourdieu. Anyway.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah. So at that point, say we decide that it's good to go, that we think we should send it to review. We will choose one of our associate editors on the basis that they don't have too many papers that they're managing at the time, or else it's usually we hope that it's their areas of expertise. So we've got a couple of people who are good at quant studies, and we'll send those people the quant studies to manage through the review process. So we try to fit as much as possible workload and expertise. Sometimes Karen and I will take them on. Sometimes there's a conflict of interest, which means that either Karen or I don't have anything to do with the paper, and we make sure that one of particular associate editor doesn't have anything to do with the paper. Even we don't tend to publish first name publications from the editorial team, but we have published some things that the editorial team contributes to, and that's another reason for choosing who. At that point, the person who's managing the paper will identify 2 or 3 reviewers and contact them through the system. So we do that through, I think there's a question about that later on, so I won't go into that. And then usually the reviewers say they can't do it, so then we find some more. And then the reviews come back, and the associate editor looks at them, makes a recommendation like, particularly attend to this, and makes a decision about whether it should be, the authors should be asked, it could be reject, it could be minor revisions, it could be major revisions, or it could be accept. It's pretty much never just accept. We've never had one that's just accept. It's mostly major revisions. Sometimes it's reject, and sometimes it's minor revisions. That goes back to the authors. The authors have a time frame in which they can review their article and respond to all the comments that the associate editor or the editor and the reviewers have made. So they send back a document where all their responses are documented, and they send back a revised version of the manuscript. Again, that will go out to review. If they've been asked to do major revisions, it won't. If they've been asked to do minor revisions, the associate editor will just check it off. When it comes back, and eventually when the associate editor is convinced that it's ready for publication, then they get a letter saying it's conditionally accepted, and at that point they're asked to de-anonymise it, i.e. to put their names back in, put the name of the university, ethics back in, and that final version is the accepted version. That takes months. Sally, you told me how long it usually takes, didn't you?
It varies. It can take months. Yeah.
The real hold up is usually chasing up the reviewers who say they'll do the review, and then when they don't, it can just take a long time, because say someone says they'll do a review, then they don't, then you wait for the 2 months for them to do the review, and then you have to appoint another reviewer. So it can be really protracted in ways that we can't always control, but we try very hard to keep it moving through, because we know how important it is to authors. Okay, I'll shut up for a bit now.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was surprised that so much of that process is managed by the associate editors. I didn't realise they had that kind of a role.
Yeah, that's quite usual for journals, just because, but I know Christy and Joanne, the previous editors-in-chief of Health Sociology Review, did most of the managing of papers themselves. I don't know how they managed, I don't know how they did that. It's just very time consuming. It requires a lot of thought too, to look at reviews, and sometimes reviewers will send back kind of silly comments, and you want to point out to the authors of the paper, look, don't bother too much about this, but it's really, really important that you focus on what reviewer B said, blah, blah, blah. Like you can't just rely on the reviewers to do all the work. Actually, it's a lot of work being an associate editor or managing a paper. And the best ones will give comments as well.
And then do you, as the editor, so when you submit a journal and you get your reviews back, that then typically come from you, or is that written?
Yes, the email will come from me, but I'll CC in the associate editor. Yeah. And I will almost always go with the associate editor's recommendation. In fact, I will always go with the associate editor's recommendation. So the associate editor, say we get one review that comes back saying major revisions, one that comes back saying minor revisions, we'll usually go for the major. And I will always kind of respect what the associate editor has suggested that we put. So although the correspondence comes from me or Karen, a lot of the intellectual work is done by the associate editors in looking through the paper.
Wow, I learnt something new. I've learnt many new things today, but that's one of the biggest ones. Did you want to add anything to that, Allegra?
Our process is very similar to what Sarah described. So yeah, we have a wonderful team of associate editors, and I must say they do an amazing job. So we tried, because we're a general journal, we tried to have a group of people, and that they're up on our website. We tried to have a group of people with different areas of expertise, so that we can try and funnel papers to different people according to their areas. Obviously, we get papers that are out of anyone's area of expertise, plus we get often we get a lot of papers from certain areas, so the people that are managing those papers end up a bit overloaded, so we try and share it around a bit. But yeah, so once the initial kind of checks have been done on a paper, I funnel it through to Helen, and then we funnel it through to an appropriate editor, and then they take on the job of finding the reviewers. Often, particularly if it's something that's very much in their area of expertise, they can often, call on people who they know personally, which helps. This isn't always possible. It just depends, and then it's up to them to find the reviewers, and finding reviewers really is the most difficult part of it all. Partly because people, I don't know, I have nothing to compare it to because I've only been doing the role since January, but people certainly at the moment, it's reflective of the wider field in academia. Everyone's very, very busy and overstretched. Those of us who are still lucky enough to be working are very overcommitted. So it is hard to find people, and often we're finding that people want to have extensions to do their reviews and things at the moment. So authors are having to wait perhaps a little bit longer than we'd like them to. But yeah, other than that, the process is very, very much how Sarah described. It's very similar at JOS,
And I think one thing that's kind of useful to bear in mind is that the editors and the associate editors are doing a lot of work for you when they look at your paper. There's a lot of time that people are putting in. So just to be mindful of that when in any correspondence, that a lot of people are trying their best to help you with the paper. And if it does end up getting rejected, to understand that we've all invested in the paper and tried pretty hard to get it up.
I guess that ties in well with the next question. And also we've had a question from in the chat about how one becomes a reviewer. So you mentioned before that the associate editors are responsible. They might call on people they know or people they're aware of. I guess, how do you become a reviewer? What is the process?
Oh, that's such a great question, because we're so desperate for reviewers. I think if you're interested, email the journal editors of a journal and say, I'm really interested in being a reviewer. I could review papers on this, that, or the other thing.
Oh, that'd be
yeah, because we're always just so desperate. Yeah, I can just see a question here from Josephine too. How much time you as editors give to this work? I can't really say, and I get an allocation from La Trobe. It's part of my community service, but I just squeeze it in all over the place. A lot of it happens on Sundays. There's no, things have gone mental with teaching. It's hard. I reckon it takes half a day a week, at least.
Yeah, it sounds like it's quite a significant commitment.
Which is why I don't know how Joanne and Christy did all the paper management as well.
Maybe they didn't sleep.
They're superior human beings.
Can I just jump in? Sorry.
Yeah, of course, Sally.
Just in regards to becoming a reviewer, the other thing people can do is go to the journal's website and open up an account, and then that they can indicate there that they want to be a reviewer.
Oh, I didn't know that. But yes, it's actually a really good thing to do, reading other people's papers and working out what's strong about the papers and how they need to fix them up. I think I've learned a lot about writing through criticising other people. That's terrible.
Is this something PhD students could do?
Absolutely, yeah. I think perhaps, once they've got a handle on the topic, and then we try to get a balance of reviewers. If we had one very junior reviewer or inexperienced reviewer, we'd try to have another or two other ones. What qualifications do you need to be a reviewer? You just need to have some expertise in the academic area under study. So you don't need qualifications. You need expertise. So really, we tend to choose people who've published in the area. That's how we know that they've got expertise.
That actually ties in really well to a question I had earlier that was posted through to me about whether you need a completed thesis in order to publish, or should we be starting to we don't need to have finished our PhD before we start publishing? Well,
it's a tricky question, and students, I know a lot of my students are really under pressure to start publishing while they're writing the thesis and to do a PhD with publication. It's not for everybody, because it is really quite hard to get a publication up. It can be extremely time consuming, and there's a lot of pressure on people to get through the PhD in the 3.5 years. So I reckon publish when you've got something really good to say. Don't use it up and then have, put something crappy out and not be able to publish something really great at the end. But yes, for the purposes of getting a PhD done, having publications along the way is fantastic. For people who want to apply for postdocs, it's really difficult now if you don't have publications to even be in the running. So there's lots of reasons to publish while you're doing your PhD, but make sure you've got something good to say. And we can't put things through because they're PhD students' work. We can often tell when it's people who haven't published much, but we can't kind of put the bar down lower for people who haven't published before.
Yeah. So just there's been some good suggestions coming through the chat as well about starting to once you start to publish in particular areas and you're known in that area, you're more likely to be invited as a reviewer. But I think what Sally said about making sure you tick that box when you create accounts for submitting to different journals and indicate that you're willing to be a reviewer.
And I think that's really true what someone's written there, that as soon as you submit something to a journal, they'll be onto you. They'll be like, okay, we'll ask them to review. And at that point, I always feel like, well, I better do it.
You're like, someone reviewed mine, so I better.
Or my paper's under review at this journal, I better say yes.
I remember reading somewhere that we should be reviewing 4 papers for every paper we submit, or something like that. Not necessarily for the same journal, but just in general to keep the system going.
Well, that doesn't make sense if you're in a large authorial team, but equivalent for each paper, I don't know, if you can do some equivalence.
Yeah, larger team.
Probably, yeah.
And I guess obviously the reviewers, we've talked a lot about desk reject and how that you decide whether or not to send out for review. I guess once it's got past that point and you've sent it out, do you prioritize manuscripts in any particular way for how they go out to associate editors? Is it just
No, we just make a decision with every manuscript. Is it good enough to go to, does it suit our journal? And if so, is it strong enough to go to review? There's no prioritisation.
Would that be the same at Journal of Sociology, Allegra?
Yeah, they just come in and as I say, get allocated to editors and then dealt with, I guess, in order of the way they came in. Yeah, there's definitely no other sort of prioritisation that goes on.
Great. And then I guess, so say we are successful, we've submitted, we get through the desk reject process, it goes out for review, it comes back. We've already talked a little bit about perhaps more polite email responses, but what sort of things should we do when we're responding to reviewer comments or responding to the editor in relation to the reviews?
You go first this time, Allegra.
So do you mean in your response to reviewers document?
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about? Yeah. So in your response to reviewers document, at the end of the day, the best approach is to be super grateful that they've given time to your paper to review it, because what you really want is that same reviewer to look at the second version, because it's much more difficult for you as an author if a different reviewer looks at the second version, because usually they'll think of a whole set of new things to change. So you want to keep that reviewer on side if you can. So being defensive about things, you don't have to do everything that they say, but if you're going to justify not doing one of their suggestions, then be polite about it, be nice about it, be professional about it, and keep that reviewer on side, because we really rely on reviewers to look at a second version. So that you don't have to go through the whole world of pain of essentially starting the process again if a new person looks at it. The other thing to say is that if you're lucky enough, it might not seem lucky, but if you're lucky enough to have your paper sent out for review in the first place and then receive a revise and resubmit notice, you are so much nearly there compared to what you were at the beginning. It might not seem like a good result, but it is a good result, because you're so much more likely to get that paper published if you're given the opportunity to revise and resubmit. That they wouldn't bother with you. They wouldn't bother with your paper if they didn't think there was some hope of it getting published in the end. So do that revise and resubmit. Like I say, you don't necessarily have to do everything, but just if you don't do everything that's suggested, justify it nicely in your response document. Explain why. The reviewer won't mind, but they'll prefer it if you do it in a nice way, and they'll look upon the whole thing in a more favourable light if you do it in a certain way. And just other than that, why wouldn't you do the things that are being suggested? Because your paper is, it's on its way to being published at this point if you play your cards right. Yes, it's not a guarantee, and we do say that with the revise and resubmit notice. We do say there's no guarantee, but there's an awful lot more guarantee than there was at the beginning of the process, because we've already invested quite a considerable amount of time and thought into your paper, as have several other people by this point. So we wouldn't be doing that if we didn't think it was worth it. So it's always worth, responding as positively as you can to a revise and resubmit. And the hope is that every time you do something more to that paper, you might have to do several rounds, but it gets that much closer to being published. It's not getting further away from being published, because if that was the case, your paper would have been rejected by now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what else, Sarah, you think?
I'm just looking at some of the questions, and Emma's made a really great piece of advice about sitting about just having a couple of days before you start doing the revisions. Let yourself settle so that you do it in a calm way. I always do that. And someone's made a comment about imposter syndrome. And I think you've answered it too, Anthony. I guess we all get imposter syndrome. It certainly never goes away for me. But I think one of the things to keep in mind if you're asked to be a reviewer and you're worried about whether you've got the skills to do it, is that there's a few people who are going to review the paper, so it doesn't all hang on your assessment of it. And secondly, you can also put comments to the editor into the spot on the web page and say and tell them what you think you're good at assessing and what you're not. So I just did a paper that was pretty quantitative in an area that I know a reasonable about. So I just wrote a little note to the so I didn't do it, I reviewed it. I just wrote a little note to the editors saying, I'm not qualified to assess the statistical analysis, but I have reviewed the discussion and the implications and blah, blah, blah. So you don't have to know everything about the paper.
So that would be perfectly acceptable then for you to receive from a reviewer.
Absolutely. I find that really helpful. I think that's great. I understand why they haven't said anything about the statistical methods. I'll make sure some other reviewers covered off on that.
Great. And I think there was one other question too about what happens if you get 2 R&Rs.
I've just answered that one with Sonia. Hi, Sonia. I don't know if we've met, but nice to meet you. Yeah, do the revisions. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you is my answer. I've got a paper in with Rural Sociology at the moment, which is a US journal that some of you would be familiar with. And we've had to do a couple of rounds of quite hefty revisions, but we're inching closer, and I'll be very surprised if in the end, I'm sure our paper is going to be published in the end, but why wouldn't we jump through the hoops? I mean, to me, it's not worth fighting. You can fight the battles, but you won't get anywhere.
And the paper might end up better.
And the paper is almost like certainly this paper in question is definitely way better than it was in the beginning, and it is more suitable for the journal too.
Yes, I think nothing about doing 2 rounds of revisions.
Me neither. Just do it. Everybody is doing it. That is how people are getting published. There might be some very lucky people that aren't doing it, and also, you know, some superhuman people of whom we've already discussed. There might be some of those people, but I haven't met too many of them. Just on what Sarah said before, we did actually recently have a paper that was an accept straight away, accept from both of the reviewers, and it went all the way through. But that is the only one that we've. Wow! And I was absolutely stunned by that, because we'd never had that before. But in general, it's not at all uncommon for people to get major revisions is by far the most common outcome. So just get on with it. That's what I do as an author, and that's what I would advise as an editor.
I'm going to have to jump out because I've got to go to this hearing thing.
I was going to say we're at time. I'm sure we could keep this conversation going for a long time, but we'll cut it off here. Thank you so much to both Sarah and Allegra, and thank you to anyone who's apologies to anyone whose questions we didn't quite get.
Thanks, Sally, for backing me up.
Yes, definitely.
To Laura as well. You've done a fantastic job during this session. I'm very impressed.
I learned so much. I thought I knew things. Turns out I know very little.
Oh, you knew a lot of things.
Most of my life.
You knew a lot. You now know more.
Thank you so much. The recording will be up on YouTube if you would like to rewatch any or all of it. And we will see you all at the next Taza Thursday. Keep an eye out.
Thanks for organising. Good on you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining us.
Bye.